Chapter 10, we looked at, how cells divide. One cell, one eukaryotic cell primarily, one cell became two via, mitosis, prophase, prometa, meta, and a telophase cytokinesis. Chapter 11, we looked at meiosis, the making of gametes, how one cell goes through a first division, becomes two, and those two cells will then immediately go through a second set of divisions to make four haploid cells, the gametes. Here in chapter 12, we're going to be looking at, we're going to take this a step further. We're going to be looking and examining how different traits, different characteristics will be passed on generation to generation to generation. Why you look a little bit like mommy, a little bit like daddy, but still uniquely yourself, and mommy and daddy look a little bit like grandma and grandpa, but still uniquely their own, and so on and so forth. This idea of studying how traits are passed on generation to generation, it's nothing new. Since the beginning of time, since we've started domesticating animals, different types of cattle, different horses, dogs, all of these, we have tried to breed the best. Breed what's going to give us, the best cow for the best milk, the strongest horse, the fastest horse, the bigger dogs, the smaller lap dogs, for whatever reason you want those. We didn't understand how these traits, these characteristics we want, were passed on. We just knew they were. So when you look at some of these commonly held beliefs that go back to ancient Greek, ancient Chinese, ancient African ideas of how things were passed on, not only as humans, but the animals. Everything from the homunculus, the idea that in the male ejaculate for whatever animal, for us, dogs, cows, whatever, that within that there will be sperm. Inside the sperm is the fully formed animal, the fully formed person, and it just needs to get into the uterus where it'll grow and develop. There are many numerous ideas of things like this, that in the man's seed is whatever's needed, and the woman has all, there's also the female version of this, the man's seed is there and is needed to take care of, blah, blah, blah. As we've progressed as societies, as we've gone from a naturalist view of the science of the world around us, and we've slowly developed to a few centuries ago where we became what we would think of as, budding scientists, the beginning of the scientific method. We started to go from the homunculus ideas or the paternal hereditary to more of this blending inheritance idea that offspring are, a blends of the best of both the male and the female parents. We've began to see that, well, maybe there's more going on. Maybe there is some rhyme or reason how things are passed on. We owe great debt to the work of Gregor Mendel. The first sub-bullet, the father of genetics. It's a bit of a joke. I mean, you look at his picture above my head here, he was a priest, Father Gregor Johann Mendel. was a priest. Okay, so father of genetics, the guy who started it, father, Catholic Church, ha ha ha. Yeah, okay. We have to keep in mind that Mendel really had no background in biology. Genetics wasn't even around yet. We still didn't even know what DNA was. Got to remember his work was mid 1800s, at least a century before Watson and Crick. Few, I think 3 or 4 decades before we even knew what was inside the nucleus. Oh, there's proteins, there's sugars, different things like that. But we still had no idea what DNA was. And he did all of his work using pea plants. And the amazing thing is, he was more of a mathematician than anything else. So what we now know about genetics was based on a man counting. A man counting generation after generation after generation, keeping track of who and what, and counting thousands upon thousands of plants. And like any good mathematician, noticing there's patterns in the numbers. Based on what he saw visually, colors, textures, heights, things like that. And the numbers, he had to come up with a means for explaining what his data showed him. Okay, instead of coming up with some idea and then trying to shoehorn the data into it, he looked at the data first and then tried to come up with a means of explaining what he sees in the numbers, in the patterns. Throughout this chapter, we're going to see that Mendel came up with some ideas, some laws, some terminology, some ways of thinking about genetics that a century and a half later, well, getting close to almost 2 centuries later, we still use these ideas. We still use the nomenclature, the words he developed. Now, we may have over the decades, we may have modernized it or built upon it, but we still use what he developed. Mendel looked at his pea plants and he noticed what he called some characters or characteristics. Flower color, height, pea texture, things like that. He then noticed that there were certain traits that went with the characteristics. Flower color, purple, white. Height, tall, short, so on. And it's amazing what he was able to do with an extremely simple plant. And we have to keep this in mind. His model, what he used, these pea plants, are just amazing. What we've been able to see is that by him using pea plants, instead of trying to study humans, instead of trying to study animals or other plants, it was, I don't want to say happenstance, but somebody upstairs was looking out for Father Mendel here. Because look at the advantages as discussed in your textbook. First, the generation time. He was able to get a couple of planting seasons, a couple of plantings every year out of his pea plants. The pea plants produce large number of offsprings. I mean, just think of the first two right there. It's going to be hard with most of higher order animals. It's going to be hard with us humans. I mean, you look at some cattle or some, large animals, they're born and they may reach sexual maturity for reproduction within 3 or 4 years. For us humans, you're looking at what, 12 to 15 years? Number of offspring, Most large animals, most mammals, I mean, for most of us, it's one, maybe two. Yes, there are some animals like pigs and whatnot that can have litters, but still, that's a small number every year, whatever. And then, more importantly, he can control. As you look at the picture above my head, go through, cut the cut the pistils, collect the pollen, or cut the stamens, go through, collect the pollen, put it on the carpels, so that way he can choose which plant mates with which plant. Boom. Very ingenious.